Now, between the Old Testament and the New Testament, there was a period of some 300 to 400 years when God was silent and said nothing, which was a very strange experience. There was no prophet to tell them what God was saying. And so they grew up in that time teachers called scribes. And these scribes would take what God had said in the past and was written in our Old Testament and then explain it and apply it. And I'm afraid they would slip in quite a bit of their own ideas at that time, which became known as the traditions. And it was during that period that there was a furious discussion about divorce and remarriage. And there were two scribes in particular that we need to talk about, whose names we think, we don't know this, but we think they were around at Jesus' time. And they were debating this issue on the basis of Deuteronomy 24, where it's said that divorce, for some cases, can be over an unclean thing. And the great debate was, what is this unclean thing? It was a superfluous debate because Deuteronomy 24 also allowed a husband to divorce his wife simply because he wanted to. But they centered this whole debate on this unclean thing. What was a legitimate reason for divorce and what was not? And the two scribes who were prominent leaders in the debate were Hillel, H-I-L-L-E-L, and Shammai, S-H-A-M-M-I-A. And we presume that these were the two schools of thinking about divorce and remarriage, which caused so much discussion in Jesus' day. And the big question he was asked was which view he subscribed to. Because the view of Shammai was the strict view that he said the unclean thing is adultery only. Whereas Hillel was more liberal than that and said it could be for other things, like a wife burning the breakfast, like a wife talking to men in the street, like a wife shouting at her husband. And he had a whole list of things that he felt were unclean things and justified divorce. So it was a big debate between the strict view, adultery only, and the liberal view of quite a long list. Both agreed there had to be a valid reason for divorce and remarriage. Actually, they were quite wrong. At least Shammai was quite wrong to say it was divorce. And since Hillel included that, he was also wrong because adultery in the Old Testament was punished by death. So it couldn't have been the unclean thing in Moses, but that's what they were saying. Shammai said it's only adultery, and Hillel said it's adultery plus, a lot of other reasons. But they were both wrong to include adultery because it was a capital crime and was punished by death, which of course did release one party to marry again since their partner was dead, been put to death. Well, now those were the scribes. Whether or not Shammai and Hillel were contemporaries of Jesus, no one knows for sure. But the way that Jesus discussed it seems to hint that people were asking, are you for Shammai or Hillel? And that may well be true. Those two scribes were followed by another scribe called Akiba, A-Q-I-B-A, if you're writing things down, and he went really liberal. But he came after Jesus, and he said you can be divorced for any reason at all or no reason at all, just your choice. That's how the laws of England followed the same downward trend. You had to establish a real reason, especially adultery, 100 years ago in England. And I'm afraid there were many hotels in Brighton, which is about 50 miles from London, where the hotels offered a chambermaid who would sleep with you the night and then swear afterwards that you had committed adultery, and then you could divorce your wife. It was called off to Brighton for the day, and it was a well-known way of getting a ground for a divorce. Of course, it was ridiculous, but it happened. But then from divorce, there came cruelty, there came abuse, physical or mental, there came insanity, and gradually the grounds for divorce increased from a chamois position of mainly adultery to all sorts of other reasons. But I was on the commission in the middle of the 1960s when the government said, we're going to cancel having to make a reason for a divorce and simply make it if they want a divorce. And it was really following Shammai, Hillel, and Akiba. And this is the way things go in society, in a liberal direction. And they just gradually increase the grounds for divorce and remarriage and then abolish them altogether and allow people simply to decide. Those who then get divorced and remarried are simply regarding marriage as a contract which has been broken in some way. So that's the background in the Bible to Jesus. And I now want to look at what he said, because for the Christian, what Jesus says comes high above everybody else. We follow Christ, who is the way, the truth, and the life. And therefore it's vital what Jesus said. And indeed we are disciples if we observe whatever he commanded us. And there's no doubt he included divorce and remarriage in his teaching. It's in the first three Gospels. In the fourth Gospel, we have some critical examples of how Jesus dealt with situations like this. But in the first three, we have his teaching. And there are three aspects, therefore, to Jesus' teaching and example. I want to speak first about his explanation as to why he took such a strong line on divorce and remarriage. Second, his exception. He did make an exception to his rule. And thirdly, his example of how he dealt with such situations. Then we'll move on to what Paul said. He said more than any of the other apostles on this subject. In fact, there's a whole chapter, 1 Corinthians 7, on this very subject. But he did also mention it in Romans and in his pastoral epistles to Timothy. So we'll look at all that in Paul in a moment. But first, what Jesus said. His explanation. Jesus took a stricter view of divorce and remarriage than Moses, certainly, whom he criticized, or at least he said Moses was a compromise. And he went right back to Genesis 2 for the basis of his views. And then the exception he made in his example. But the explanation for his strict view, extremely strict view, a view that no other moral teacher has ever risen to, the highest standard of all. And you'll find this in Luke and Mark. in Luke chapter 16, verse 18, and in Mark chapter 10. Now, this is very significant because both Mark and Luke were written for unbelievers and written for Gentiles. And to the Gentile world, Jesus makes an absolute statement, an absolute prohibition, with no exception, with no qualifications. The only qualifications he makes are in Matthew. And that's very significant. So Mark and Luke give us Jesus' rule, which is the heart of his teaching. And that's the very basis. There's no point in discussing exceptions until you believe his rule. And his rule is in Mark and Luke. Mark 10, Luke 16. And that rule is very simple and very clear. And the rule is, whoever divorces his wife and marries another woman is committing adultery. And whoever marries a divorcee is also committing adultery. Now that simple rule needs to be unpacked a little. Adultery is the sin of a married person. Fornication is the sin of an unmarried, but adultery, for which the Greek word is moichaia, M-O-I-C-H-I-A, moichaia, that is always the sin of a married person. And therefore what Jesus is saying is, God doesn't recognize divorce. A divorce may be perfectly legal, and man may accept the marriage is over, but God doesn't. And therefore, if he marries again after a divorce, that's adultery against his first partner, to whom in God's sight he is still married. Now, I hope you follow that. I'm just unpacking what he said. Adultery, since it can only be the sin of a married person, means that after the divorce, the person is still married. In God's sight, not in man's. In man's, the marriage is dissolved, but in God's sight, it's still there. And therefore, if he has sex with someone else, even though it's legal and it's within marriage, is actually adultery. And whoever marries a divorcee is doing the same thing. They are committing adultery against the woman's first husband because they are still married. That's the explanation of the very strict line that Jesus took against divorce and remarriage. Neither counts with God, because they are all still married to their original partner in his sight, and therefore are committing adultery. The next thing I want you to notice is that that verb, committing adultery, is in the present continuous tense in the Greek. And I've told you that means to go on doing something, to do it continually, which means that in the remarriage, every time they have sexual intercourse, they are continuing committing adultery. They're living a life in an adulterous relationship, which God does not recognize. That's the heart of Jesus' teaching. In Luke, it's only one verse where he was talking to wealthy Pharisees who were quite notorious for changing their partners. And they were doing so on the teaching of the Jewish scribes. And when they asked Jesus, now which side are you on, Shammai or Hillel? He said, neither. I'm against it altogether, because in my Father's sight, it's adultery. It's the sin of married people. Now that's the basic thing. Mark does expand that. It begins with a discussion with Pharisees, and Jesus and they discussed what Moses said, and Jesus said that was the old law for Jews, but I've come with a much stricter law. And after they have a public discussion with the Pharisees, they have a private discussion with the disciples and Jesus on their own. And they said, do you really mean that? And he said, yes, I do. Anyone who marries a divorcee, or anyone who divorces his wife and remarries, that's adultery in my Father's sight. Now, so far, that's quite uncompromising. It's quite absolute. Divorce and remarriage are wrong.